Hello and welcome back to the State of Education. I'm Katie and I'll be your guide as we discuss the topics for part 2 of the teachers' unions, good or bad for your children. Today we'll be discussing the second half of the teachers' union discussion. In last week's episode, we were talking about the history of the teachers' unions here in America and how they evolved from their noble beginnings. Not just the teachers' unions, though, but all unions. And I'm really excited to continue this discussion with you today as we move into the modern era of teachers' unions and look at what's actually going on in the classrooms. So come on in and have a seat while we discuss the teachers' unions, good or bad for your children, part 2. Now that we understand the background of the public teachers unions, and I've pointed out some of the aspects of it that make unions in general, but the public education unions, the public teachers unions especially, kind of these double-edged swords. They're making sure that these teachers have okay working environments, and they also are making sure that the pay that these teachers receive keeps up with the general rate of inflation to make sure that an individual can make a living for themselves and or their families, depending on what's necessary. But despite all of the good things that these teachers unions have done and all of the progress that they've made, once you reach a certain point as a union, there's not really much more that you can fight for. By the time that you reach that point, there's so much infrastructure that's behind you that you have to almost create problems so that you can solve them, so that the high-paid presidents and CEOs and everybody that works for them within the unions doesn't go away. Because as these teachers unions grew bigger and bigger and bigger, the problems that they faced on an individual basis in the classroom became bigger and bigger and bigger. Because as this report that I mentioned earlier, the origins of unions and their applications to teachers, the teachers unions are supposed to help the individual teacher have a say in what's done every single day in their classroom and how that affects their students. But actually, in practice, it kind of does the opposite. It has the opposite effect. So when this started happening was when the education system became nationalized. So it became federal. The Department of Education was originally created in 1867 to collect information on schools and teaching that would help the states establish effective school systems. That's a direct quote from the Department of Education itself. I will again go ahead and make sure that that is linked in the references at one-roomeducation.com for you. But I wanted to point out that the Federal Department of Education, as it exists in the United States today, admits on their own website the first sentence in their history was that they were established to collect information on schools and teaching to help the states establish effective school systems. Now, it's important to understand why that phrase, the states establish effective school systems, is so important, especially to someone like me who studies history and the constitutionality of the quote unquote progress that has been made. We talked about these giant national teachers unions, how they started out as small local regional unions to help these teachers improve their working conditions and the classroom conditions for their students. Yes, absolutely. So why and how did these teachers unions become national? That's where this date of 1867 was so important, because before 1867, the federal government had nothing to do with the education of the populace. The federal government understood that the Constitution and the amendments said that anything that was not explicitly stated to be under the power of the federal government was to be remanded to the powers of the states, which meant that if it wasn't written specifically in the Constitution that the federal government had control over the education of the populace, then it wasn't their job, and it was each individual state's job to educate the individual state citizens. Why would this be an issue? Why am I even talking about this? And why did the founding fathers set up the education system to be state and local instead of federal? And why am I talking about it in an episode about unions? I promise it'll all make sense here in like a couple minutes. If you remember, the NEA, the National Education Association, was established in 1857. That is a full 10 years before the Federal Department of Education was established. And even then, it was only as a data collection agency, essentially, for the states. So what happened between 1857 and 1867 that established the federal department and the ability for these public sector unions to gain so much power? Well, the main thing that I'm pretty sure all of us know about, what happened in the 1860s, boys and girls? The Civil War. That's right. The Civil War came about. And with the Civil War came the realization that the education system in the rural South and the South in general was just, it was lacking, to say the least. What happened is a lot of people in the South would still work on their family farms during this time period. And for most of them, being literate, being able to read and write, and I mean, most of them knew how to do basic math, but being able to read and write wasn't important to them. It wasn't culturally important to them, and it wasn't economically important to them, at least in the more rural settings. And after the Civil War, everything in the South was pretty much decimated. I mean, please refer to the Reconstruction period. And this is the only time in history I will ever tell you that you can look on Wikipedia. With the Reconstruction period setting up, the federal government knew that they had to do something to educate these backwards Southerners. And that's why they set up the Department of Education, was so that they could consult with the Southern states and come up with an action plan on how to increase the literacy rates in the poorest sections of their states. I think that that's kind of a noble effort. Sorry we decimated everything about you. Glad you're still our friend. Let's try to make something right? That's essentially what happened. And with the establishment of the Department of Education in 1867, they set the groundwork for the current iteration of the Department of Education and the amount of influence they have on what your children learn in the classrooms. The Department of Education wasn't set up to have anything to do with funding. And yes, we're going back to the money, because when you're looking at something as nuanced and entangled as public sector unions, especially teachers, and the effect that they have on our children and the future of our nation, it's important to look at where the influences are coming from. So if we're looking at the fact that the Department of Education, that was originally called the Office of Education in the executive branch of the government, when we look at the fact that they were set up as a consulting office, we need to look at what happened that had them evolve into where they are today. All of that started with the passage of the Second Morrill Act in 1890. And that was when the Office of Education, the modern day Department of Education, was given funding to disperse to schools. Now, what happened was this started off with land-grant colleges and universities. So if you look at teachers' unions also, they started in colleges and universities. It starts at the top and works its way down through the education system until it eventually gets to what we have today as like Head Start and pre-K. So it started with the land-grant colleges and universities, and then it kind of trickled down over the years. So what happens whenever you give a government agency money that they then have control over what you do to get that money? they make sure that you adhere to whatever they want to get that money. That's also where the No Child Left Behind Act comes in and why all of our scoring and everything has gone down significantly. But we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a couple minutes. What we need to look at right now is the fact that a government consultation agency was given funding to disperse to public universities. Okay, sure. I'll concede that one. Sure, why not? But what happened was the federal government realized that if they were going to be the ones dispersing funds for these public institutions, that they needed to make sure that they set some sort of standard for the distribution of these funds. So what they did was they wrote national policy for colleges. That makes sense. If you're going to be dispersing funds, then you need to have some sort of criteria before those funds are dispersed. Yeah, okay, I get that. I don't agree with it, but I get it. And when these universities and everybody started getting the funding and these national standards started coming around, the union said, whoa, wait, what are you talking about? We have to adhere to national standards now. Isn't the state supposed to be in charge of this? And I can tell you, having worked in the education system, it is still confusing. It is horrible to be a teacher and have to figure out state and national standards that you have to follow because each individual state still has their own Department of Education. And here's the fun part. In order for the Department of Education to be constitutionally legal, they are not allowed to have anything to do with direct funding of the schools or direct curriculum creation of the schools. So what they do is they come up with standards and they say, if you want to get this money from the federal government that you shouldn't need, but if you want this money from the national government, then you need to adhere to this set of standards and you need to make sure that you're doing this. You need to adhere to this set of standards. And at any point, if we happen to change them mid-year, you then have to pivot and make sure that you're following the new set of standards. And oh, by the way, these policies, they're not written by teachers. They're written by politicians who, by this point in time, the mid-1800s and early 1900s, had become career politicians and had no idea what it was like to actually be in a classroom. They would say, well, we're consulting with educators. What does that even mean? Who are they consulting with? Because I can guarantee you that they're not consulting with anybody from my local school district. And they're not consulting with anybody from the inner city Detroit school districts. And they're not consulting with anybody from suburban school districts. The people that the government consults with are who? The upper level administrative people within the national teachers unions. Isn't that funny? The national teachers unions are in charge of helping the government decide how much money and what standards the teachers are required to uphold and adhere to. That's interesting, because if you look at the upper administration of the teachers unions, almost all of them, they have teaching degrees, but they have zero experience actually being in a classroom and actually working within a school district and understanding what it's like to be a teacher on the ground. So yeah, the policymakers do meet with advisory boards, but they don't consist of classroom teachers. And if they do have advisory boards of classroom teachers, they have their monthly meeting or their quarterly meeting with these teachers, and then they go back to the unions and say, is it really like this? And the union says, oh, no, it's not really like this. Here's how it really is. Here's where you need to put the funding. That's where the corruption sets in. And it's not just the teachers union that does this. It's any union does this. They help advise to create the policies that pay themselves. Because the more teachers make, the more union members make, the more dues they can pay the upper administration of the union. That, just. So, Understanding where the federal unions come in and the federal Department of Education come in are extremely important moving into current events with the teachers union, which I know is why all of you are here. You say, Katie, my kid is having to learn critical race theory. My kid is having to wear a mask. My kid can't keep up in class because the teacher moves too fast and doesn't care and doesn't take the time to work one-on-one with my kid. Any of these reasons for being here are extremely valid. And yes, almost all of them do relate directly back to the teachers unions and the policies in which they enact that their members and non-members, as we discussed earlier, are expected to adhere to. And these are enforced by the national unions through pressure and, I believe, misinformation campaigns to the parents. And one great thing that I've seen over the past 2 years has been the parents becoming awake and aware of what has been going on in their schools and in their children's classrooms. Because until the past couple of years, parents have entrusted their children to the education system that they grew up in. And they weren't aware because they're too busy working. This is not meant to be a takedown of parents that work and send their kids to public school in any way whatsoever, or to public school teachers. But what happens is that parents get caught up in working and paying the bills and making sure that their kid eats in the evening and gets back and forth to soccer and everything. And they drop their kid off at these public institutions and they say, you were good to me. I'm assuming that you're going to be good to my child, and that you're going to have their best interest at heart like I do. And I hate to tell you, public teachers unions are for-profit entities. So no, they don't have your kid's best interest at heart. You are the only one that does. Yes, that teacher that's with them most of the day does have your child's interest at heart. Whether it's their best interest, I can't tell you. Only that teacher can tell you. But the upper level administration and the unions and the government that control what goes on and what that teacher has to teach to maintain their job, they could give two craps less about your child's actual welfare and their actual ability to learn. That's your job as the parent. And if you've ever been in a parent-teacher conference, almost every single teacher will tell you that education is a team effort. It's not just send your kid to school and that's all you have to do. Make sure that they do their homework at night and that's it. Education happens 70% outside of the classroom. And every educator knows that. And that's why it's so important for parents to take an active role in their child's education. But because of social standards and because of economic pressure that's been put on parents, that's not really feasible anymore. What is going on when we leave our kids at these public institutions with contact staff that cares for the most part? I'm not going to say all of them do because trust me, not all of them do. But for the most part, especially whenever you're talking about like primary school, absolutely most of those teachers care about their individual students and the well-being of their future. But the problem comes with the administrations and with the unions and with the governments that just put their sticky little fingers all over the poor classrooms. So let's go ahead and look at a couple examples from the past few years of how the national teachers unions, funded by your tax dollars, both state, local, and federal, have been working to indoctrinate your children and teach them what to think and what to learn, as opposed to teaching them how to be independent thinkers that know that they can do it themselves. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple examples of that from the past couple of years. The first one that we're going to look at is, of course, the big one. Yeah, the COOF, the COVID. I will admit that even I, in the beginning of COVID, said, okay, let's see what this is. It's novel. Let's see what's going on, because I truly care about my community and I want everyone in it to be safe. So, okay, 2 weeks to slow the spread. Let's do this. We can do this if we work together. Okay, cool. I get that. But what happened was this extreme political behemoth that is the teachers' unions, came out and used this to hold students and their families' mental, emotional, and economic well-beings hostage to get what they wanted, not what's best for their students. One example of this, and it's still sort of ongoing. They kind of resolved it at the beginning of January, but it's still there's still ongoing issues. In, of all places, Chicago, where one of the major teachers' unions of the United States originated. So you would expect there to be some major union movements in the Chicago school districts because of just their union history there. But when the issues arise in today's context are when the Chicago Teachers Union refuses to return to work without proper quote-unquote protection for our workers' health and safety. Now, that sounds reasonable, and that's what these people do. They take a statement that sounds completely logical and completely reasonable, and they twist it. Because what proper protection for our workers' health and safety meant was that they wanted smaller class sizes. They wanted to include certain subjects into the curriculum. They wanted everyone in the school district to have a medical procedure without exception, whether that's religious or otherwise. And I'm not going to be any more descriptive of that because I don't want to have any problems with this podcast, but you understand what I'm saying. And with current statistics coming to light in a mainstream setting, I think that most of us who are rational thinkers who can look at a situation in a rational, unbiased manner understand that that's completely insane. So what these teachers, as part of a greater union, did was they held the economy of Chicago captive, as a large percentage of minority families are one-parent households and require the ability to send their children to school to be able to go to work. Because if you're a single-parent household living in inner-city Chicago, you're not going to be able to afford childcare for older children, older school-age children, because that is not publicly funded. What is publicly funded, so far as childcare goes, is school. Absolutely. So if you shut down the schools because you want to make sure that everybody has a medical procedure and you want to make sure that you have longer breaks and you want to make sure that your working environment is better, and this is just the opportunity that has come up to you that you are able to do that in, shame on you for holding an entire economy hostage. So how did they get this kind of power? And it's absolutely crazy. We will be talking in a future episode about the introduction of the school as a paid childcare alternative. We'll get into that in a future episode. And no, that doesn't mean that teachers are just babysitters by any means, but it does mean that that's a reality of what the current educational situation is that does need to be addressed and needs to be acknowledged for us to have an honest conversation about it. Now, these teachers' unions, in addition to holding the local economies hostage and refusing to go back to work, they also lobbied the greater state governments and the national government through the Department of Education to require heavy COVID restrictions. And after some states started opening back up and saying, we're not going to expose our children to this sort of environment anymore, the unions sent more and more lobbyists and spent more and more money on political campaigns to advocate for the extension of the COVID restrictions or the reimplementation in large urban centers, specifically in California and New York. Chicago is also included in this because they're Chicago. That's all I can say. The unions, the national unions, not the individual teachers so much, but the national unions used COVID to push the agenda of quote unquote gender and racial equality. Now, the one thing that you need to understand, anytime that anybody talks about gender and racial equality, on a national level. I can almost guarantee you they're looking to make people mad and get money from them. This is just a thing. Yes, racism exists. Yes, gender inequality exists. But if you look at national policy, if you look at national law, it is not there. Gender and racial inequality does not exist on a systemic basis according to law and policy. Whether it happens on an individual basis in a contained situation is a completely different subject that I'm probably never going to talk about on this podcast because it just doesn't apply to this topic. But when the idea that because you're a girl, you inherently are viewed as less than, or because you're a boy, you need to not be able to go up to a girl and say, hey, I think you're pretty. Or if you're of a minority race, and we're going to say Black specifically here. And yes, I know that this is going to become super touchy and I'm going to have some people that absolutely hate me for this, but that's okay because it's a truth that needs to be stated, whether you agree with it or not. I don't think that Black children specifically, and Hispanic children and Asian kids, whatever, any non-white children, I don't believe that they should be made to believe that they are inherently victims. I don't believe that they should be made to think that white people, including white children, are inherently better than them through the implementation of critical race theory. Critical race theory is considered a alt-right sort of dog whistle now, but it's not. It is a genuine issue, and I will be discussing that in the next couple episodes. But the issue is that these teachers are using the classrooms to push these false narratives of gender inequality under the law and racial inequality under the law to create and recruit a new generation of activists. Now, the best example I have of this is the Project Veritas video that they did, where they exposed a California teacher for actively recruiting students. I think that he was recruiting them for the communist agenda, but it doesn't have to be communist. Whether it's communist or alt-right, which are really similar things, whether it's left-wing or right-wing policy, it doesn't really matter. As a teacher, you should not be recruiting students by telling them what to think or coercing them through fear to join your quote-unquote side. This teacher that was exposed in the Project Veritas video bragged that he was a part of a network of activist teachers that worked within that school district and within the surrounding school districts. That is terrifying. Teachers should not be political activists. Politics has no room whatsoever in a school. National or state politics have no room in a school, especially if you're talking about any subject other than the civics class. Absolutely, within the civics context, you should be intelligently discussing and debating matters that have to do with politics. But you as the teacher are there to facilitate a discussion. You are not there to impose your ideas and values on your students. I have a story that happened this year that kind of epitomizes sort of what I'm talking about, where these activist teachers are using fear to push their own political agendas to these students, and the students don't know what's going on, and the parents don't understand what's being taught in the classroom because either they just don't understand the subjects or they're busy with work and everything else that goes on with adult life. If you don't believe me that this stuff is actually going on in the schools today, I have a personal story about teachers using fear to get their students to come to their political side. I tutor students from all over the United States. This particular student happens to live in Southern California. He has pretty decent learning disabilities when it comes to English, but is almost a savant level when it comes to mathematics. So when I started tutoring him in the fall, I was working on college applications with him and essays for that. And when we were done with those, his mom said that he enjoyed me and she thought that I did such a good job with him that they wanted to keep me on as his environmental science tutor, because environmental science is one of my side passions and I tutor that on a regular basis as well. And I, of course, agreed because love the kid, love his family. They're absolutely amazing. But when I started working with this student on his environmental science work, I noticed something. And I have to put a disclosure here. I did take environmental science in high school and college. And most of the environmental science teachers, as you would suspect, are some level of environmentalists, right? And environmental activists, which I get. But what this teacher was doing was he had this student with a learning disability so scared of climate change and the effect that the human population is having on it that this student actually believed that human overpopulation was the main problem facing the planet today. Now, whether you agree with that or disagree with that is a side note to this story and the point that I'm making. A student with a learning disability was told by a teacher that human population is the main threat to this planet. And if it is not put under control, everyone essentially is going to die. Do you think that that's fair to tell a student with learning disabilities directly in regards to his English language comprehension? Do you think that that's a good thing to do that? Or do you think that it's going to scare him and have him become a little bit more extreme in what he's doing and what he's saying? Because it had a direct impact on this kid. He is wanting to go to college to help solve this problem. And when we talked about renewable energies, he was talking about how renewable energies are the only way to get us through all of this and how we have to focus on them. And when I asked him if he knew what technologies and what was involved in maintaining these quote unquote green energies, he said, well, no, you just put them up and then that's that. And when I explained to him everything that goes into wind turbines and solar panels and hydroelectric plants and everything that would traditionally be considered an alternative to fossil fuel energy, he said, oh, well, that doesn't sound very renewable or green, does it? And I said, that's up to you to decide for yourself, but I'm making sure that you have all of the information instead of just some of it. And he said, oh, well, thank you for that. And his mom, when I was talking to her the one day, and I said, hey, do you know what your son is learning here? And she was completely taken aback. She said, what do you mean he thinks that the human population needs to be decreased by 4 billion people? And I was like, yeah, that's the number he was given by this teacher to ensure that climate change wouldn't have him die. And the look on her face was, I just wanted to hug her through the computer screen, and I couldn't. But that's the effect that these teachers are having on their students. They're taking these extreme ideologies and terrifying their students into unwittingly carrying out the policies that these teachers want. So through these policies that these teachers are carrying out in the classroom of teaching critical gender theory and critical race theory, and I would propose a critical climate theory as well, they are fostering self-hatred in minority kids and a sense of helplessness and learned dependence on authority figures through the implementation of fear-based quote-unquote education. So what this does is it makes it so that these minority kids are dependent on an authority figure. And when they're young, that's their parents, that's their teachers, that's the administration. And as they get older, it starts with the teacher and then it moves to the government, whether that's local, state, or federal. They're kind of feeding into their own system by treating our children this way. And they're making white kids feel bad for just being born because they're telling non-minority students that they are responsible for the sins of their fathers, and that the only way to atone for these sins is to become a quote unquote ally. And if you're a good ally, then you'll fight with us for insert cause here. And if you don't want to fight for that cause, then you're part of the problem and you're to be shunned by your fellow classmates because you have wrongthink. I don't know about you. That, one, is not the environment that I want my children in. And two, it's not the culture that I want for the future generations of this country, let alone the world. And the only way that we're going to change this is if parents and students stand up for themselves and their education. Parents need to pay more attention to what's going on in the classroom, like they have been these past couple of years. Absolutely, I applaud the parents for finally coming in and realizing what's been going on in these classrooms for as long as I've been in education, and from the people that I've talked to over the years, it's been going on in education for a lot longer than that as well. This is an evolution, and it took a very long time for the teachers' unions and the governments to gain as much power over your child's schooling as they have. And it's going to take a big fight, metaphorically, to get control back. And what needs to happen is that we need to align ourselves with teachers that believe that this is wrong, and teachers that hold more traditional values and believe that their students need to learn how to think and how to learn instead of what to think and what to learn, need to stand up and speak out for their students' mental, emotional, and physical well-being. It's going to take all of us standing up and standing together to fix this issue. And again, I don't think that it's the individual union members. It's the national union political powerhouses that have co-opted our education system and put our nation's youth in the crosshairs to obtain their own political agendas. That's not right, whether it's left or right. And we all need to stand up and say something and do something. And that was my take on the teachers' unions within the United States specifically. I wanted to say thank you so much for joining me for today's discussion on the teachers' unions. I know it was kind of a long one and it was a lot of sticky nuance, but I really appreciate you sticking in with me because this information is so important. And if you know anyone that has a child in the public education system or know a teacher that is involved in the public education system, please make sure to share this podcast with them so that they understand what is going on and why. Because the why is almost more important than the what. If you found yourself enjoying yourself at all, please make sure to go ahead and subscribe to this podcast on whichever platform you happen to be listening to me on. If you would like to see a full list of One Room education content, including ways that you can support our work, please go ahead and head over to one-roomeducation.com. Again, that's one, the word one, one-roomeducation.com. While you're there, you can sign up to get updates right to your inbox whenever we post new content. Please make sure to follow us on social media to get behind the scenes content and so much more. On Facebook, you can find us at One Room Education, all one word. And on Instagram, you can find us at One Room _education. Again, that's One Room _education on Instagram. On that note, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today and let you know how much I'm looking forward to seeing you next time for the state of education.